What's happened in Darfur is it's rekindled a genocidal conflict of 20 years ago. And in that conflict, Arab militia have been trying to wipe out and ethnically cleanse black African ethnic groups.
I'm Roland Oliphant, and this is Battle Lines.
I made wartime decisions. I know the choices are never clear or easy for the leadership.
I just find bombs and I find dead people, but it's a really scary thing for me.
In this episode of Battle Lines, I speak to the Telegraph's Paris correspondent Henry Samuel about the unlikely link between Azerbaijan and pro-independence riots in France's Pacific island of New Caledonia. Africa correspondent Ben Farmar describes the dire humanitarian situation in the besieged Sudanese city of Fashir. And Energy Editor Jonathan Leake explains how the discovery of oil near Antarctica could spark a rush for resources at the South Pole. It's Friday, the 24th of May, 2024. This week, Emmanuel Macron flew to the South Pacific in a bid to quell pro-independence rioting that swept the island of New Caledonia. I asked our Paris correspondent, Henry Samuel, what is behind the pro-independence movement on the island, and why has France accused other countries of stoking the unrest? When did it start, Henry? Just remind me, exactly what day did this all kick off?
Riots erupted last Monday, not this Monday, the week of last week. And that was at a time where the National Assembly in Paris was discussing constitutional reform on New Caledonia. And it's a source of great tension on the Pacific territory because this new law or constitutional change would allow residents, people who live on New Caledonia, who've lived there for more than 10 years, to vote, which is not the case currently. And the Kanak, many of whom are pro-independence and have been obviously living in New Caledonia for centuries, and make up 40% of the population, which is 270,000, say that their vote will be diluted because essentially you're going to get a bunch of newcomers who are now allowed to vote. But the newcomers say, well, those people who've been there for more than 10 years, we pay our taxes and we're living here and we should have a say. So that's what started off the riots, which kind of snowballed very quickly, and roadblocks were set up and there were protests in Nouméa, the capital. And by Tuesday morning, there was kind of burnt-out cars around Nouméa, and many shops and businesses were pillaged and burned and vandalized. There were sort of more than 1,500 emergency calls and 200 fires. And very quickly, the High Commissioner declared that there was an insurrection going on, and he decreed a state of emergency on Wednesday evening for an initial duration of 12 days. That obviously meant, restricted movement of people and gatherings. And they actually also cut off some communications, including TIC, out of fear of sort of it being used to foment trouble, and also foreign interference, which I'm sure you'll be interested to talk about in a moment. So that's how things started. And it's been very difficult to get it under control. So they've sent at least 1,000 reinforcements, including the GIGN, which is the kind of elite anti-terror police, to try and calm things down. But there's still roadblocks going on today. There have been 6 people killed, including 2 gendarmes, and they've been trying to remove roadblocks, but the international airport is still blocked off, and there are more than 3,000 tourists stranded there. And obviously, just normal people living there, residents, are living in fear, and there's also very little food because all the shops have been pillaged, and it's an island, or an archipelago, I should say.
So obviously, it's very agitated. The riots are provoked by the government in Paris, or the parliament in Paris, trying to amend the constitution. There's a feeling that this undermines the protections that were in place to protect the rights of the indigenous. I suppose it's the minority now, right? Because there's only they make about 41% of the population.
It's 41% of the population. Obviously, that would go down. So there hasn't been this much violence since the 1980s when some gendarmes were taken hostage in a cave in 1988, and it ended up in a bloodbath. 19 Kanaks were killed and I believe 2 gendarmes, and that started a peace process and what's known as the Noumea Accords that have led slowly to set a series of referendums. There have been 3 referendums now on whether or not New Caledonia should have independence. The first 2 rejected independence, and the third, which is controversial, was held in 2021 during the COVID pandemic, and pro-independence, again, the no won the day, but pro-independence people there said that it doesn't count because lots of Kanaks were in mourning over dead people and deaths in the family, and they have a very kind of long mourning period, and so many of them didn't turn out to vote, so they said that should be null and void. So that's where we are. And this goes back, obviously, a very long way, all the way back to 1853, in fact, when the French first colonised New Caledonia and turned it into a kind of a colony where they would send, political opponents, and there's a long process of Kanaks trying to get more power back. Yeah.
A long-running independence struggle. It's one of these remnants of the French Empire, and it's an issue that former imperial powers, including Britain, face from time to time, with these small little islands of what's left of the great 19th century empires. But the other thing that's really interesting here is how this plays into, the contemporary power politics across the globe. So as we understand, bizarrely, surprisingly, of all the countries in the world, apparently Azerbaijan has an oar in this unrest. Could you talk us through that? What on earth is going on? How on earth we end up in a situation where a country in the southern Caucasus is accused by France of stirring up trouble in the South Pacific?
Yeah, well, Azerbaijan has a bone to pick with France. Their relations kind of nosedive in the wake of the 2020 war, and it's the 2023 offensive to regain control of this breakaway region from ethnic Armenian separatists. France backed the Armenians. So there's a very large Armenian diaspora in France, Christian. And so it turns out that Azerbaijan then invited separatists from the French territories, not just of New Caledonia, but also Martinique, French Guyana, French Polynesia, to Baku for a conference last July. And it was called the Baku Initiative Group. And its aim was to support, I quote, French liberation and anti-colonialist movements. So they have been, according to France, kind of meddling and fomenting trouble. Of course, Azerbaijan has totally denied this and said that it's baseless. But the French Interior Minister was very pointed in saying, yeah, they did have a hand. And that's not all, because also Azerbaijan is pro-Russian. And the latest development is that it has accused Russian-based hackers of mounting an unprecedented cyber attack against New Caledonia's internet network. And that just happened overnight, Tuesday, just as Emmanuel Macron was about to fly out to New Caledonia in a bid to try and calm things down. And he should be arriving as we speak. So,
well, for the benefit of listeners, we are speaking on Wednesday afternoon. So by the time you hear this interview, Monsieur Macron will presumably have been in town, and we will update you at the time about whatever comes from that.
Yeah, it looks like some hackers are struck with the aim of saturating the New Caledonia network. Obviously, it's an archipelago, and there's only one real kind of internet access. So in a way, it's quite easy to do that. And they say the majority of IP addresses came from Russia. I see now that Le Monde has saying we should be a little bit cautious about this, and whether it really did come from Russia and just how bad it was. There does seem to be a little bit of over-egging foreign intervention on the part of the French government, and critics are saying this is a bit of being used as a bit of a smokescreen. The real problems are far deeper than that, and they really do not. You can't blame it all on Azerbaijan and Russia. But of course, these are opportunistic states who are quite happy to try and cause a bit of trouble. And obviously, TikTok is Chinese, and so there's a suggestion that perhaps they too could be meddling. But
let's just talk a little bit about that, China, Henry, because the other thing that I think you mentioned when we were talking about before was about New Caledonia's natural resources and the nickel mines. And of course, China is not only a massive power in the region, but it's also, a massive power when it comes to, the precious and rare metals market. So what's the story there?
Yes, well, I mean, it's not very necessarily well known, but New Caledonia has one of the world's largest nickel resources. Some say the second largest. And so obviously nickel is used in electric batteries, and given that we're all trying to buy electric cars, suddenly this has become a major issue. The problem is that essentially China has been flooding the market with overproducing nickel, and so as has Indonesia, which has got 75% of the world market, I believe, both of them, but been flooding the market with cheap nickel, and it means that it's become economically unviable, really, to produce nickel in New Caledonia. So that the French government has been desperately trying to kind of salvage that, because apparently the nickel economy employs 70,000 out of the island's 270,000 residents. So it's a hugely important industry. And so the finance minister has created what he said was a nickel pact. And essentially they're offering almost free or very subsidized electricity to operate these mines. But despite that, the operators of the mines have been pulling out one by one. And the suggestion is that China is waiting in the wings and waiting for the ripe fruit to fall so that it could then, at a later stage, move in and start operating those mines. I mean, that's obviously not going to happen straight away, but that's the theory. So there is that, there's that strategic reason why New Caledonia is important. And of course, it's in the Indo-Pacific. And Macron has made it very clear that France wants to be a player, a balancing power between China and the US in the Indo-Pacific. And he went last year to the area and he said that you might call us colonialists, but essentially France offers prop independence, and China, he said pointedly, has gone to supposedly independent countries who signed huge contracts with them. And look at them now. They're saddled with debt. They've lost their land. They've lost their industrial sovereignty, and it was taken away from them. And that France can offer something kind of a third way. And you have to remember as well that France really got its fingers massively with the AUKUS debacle, if you remember. It had a huge submarine contract with Australia, which was seen as hugely important strategically for France. And at the 11th hour, Australia cancelled this contract and gave it to the US and the UK. And the defence minister at the time described this as a stab in the back to France. To lose New Caledonia would be another major blow in the region, because it is seen as, it's known as le caillou, the pebble, but it may be a small foothold, but it is an important strategic foothold in the region.
So that everything you've described is absolutely fascinating. And I think the way that this brings together contemporary politics, tensions in Europe, tensions in the Caucasus, the whole Indo-Pacific question, the tensions between old Europe and the rising powers of China and Russia, but also this echo of the old European empires and the process of decolonization. We can find all of those in this story, which is fascinating. And of course, just to finish, you're obviously not there, but you are sitting in the old imperial capital. How is this going down inside France? And generally, what is the French attitude towards its little bits of empire that it still has scattered around the globe? Is this something they've seen a lot of in other places?
France has got, it's a very interesting, the way when you look, I've been to several dom-toms which are overseas departments and territories, and you have to know that places like Guadeloupe, a Caribbean island, is just considered another département of France. It's just another, Paris is 75 and Guadeloupe has got its own number, and you make a phone call, instead of it being 01, it's 05, and there we are, you phone up, you're phoning the other side of the world. And you get the same. The post office is the same. The roadsides, everything's the same. So it's just like it's another part of France. And yet, so there's this kind of attempt to assimilate it's kind of worked, I suppose, in some places. There is a strange atmosphere in quite a lot of these dom-toms. And New Caledonia has always had this incredibly strong pro-independence movement and sense of that they've been shortchanged in history. I mean, there was a skull of a Kanak leader that's, at least until recently, in a French Paris museum. There's a lot of bad blood there. So that's not surprising that it's still coming back to haunt. Yeah, they have a very different approach to the UK, and they've managed to hold on to these bolt holes around the world. For how much longer remains to be seen, and it will be very interesting to follow what happens. People don't know that much about New Caledonia. The average French person in the street doesn't know that much about New Caledonia. They know that there are issues there. It's also considered to be a sort of paradise destination for tourists with lovely beaches and stuff. But in terms of politically, there is clearly a left-right divide. The left are very much anti-colonial and say we should give them as much autonomy or independence as possible. And I suppose you could say that more of the right are for keeping sort of France as it is and keeping all of its former colonies as they are. But it's not quite as simple as that. But there is also a sense that Macron has not played his cards well here. There is a general sense that he was too biased towards loyalists, those who do not want independence for New Caledonia. And by deciding to go ahead with this constitutional vote, and then also telling all parties, if you don't come to an agreement, I'm going to push this through by the end of June this year. That was considered to be accelerating the process too much, because Kanaks and New Caledonians, they traditionally need a lot of time and to talk these things through, and there's a sense that it's been somehow a bit hijacked by Paris, and they have had not as much say as they feel they should. So he's accelerated the process too much, and it's now coming back to haunt him. So there is quite a lot at stake here for Macron, and which is probably why he's flown out in person to try and sort it out. François Mitterrand, after the 1988 violence that I mentioned in this cave in Nouméa, he flew out and he did manage to turn things around and start a peace process again and calm things down. And, it's a tall order for Macron to do the same. We'll have to see whether he manages it or not. But if he doesn't, you can be sure that this will be used by his opponents as ammunition with the upcoming European elections, because there's very little about the EU in these elections campaign here in France. It's very much a kind of referendum for or against a Macron. So that will be used as a stick to hit him with, amongst other things.
This week, British Foreign Secretary Lord Cameron warned that 800,000 refugees could face massacre if the besieged city of El Fashir in Sudan's Darfur province falls to the Rapid Support Forces. Our Africa correspondent Ben Farmar has been speaking to civilians inside the besieged city. I began by asking him about the situation around and inside the besieged city. Ben, what can you tell me about the situation around the city?
Well, it's very, very dire. So just as a bit of context, El Fashir is the administrative hub of the Darfur region of Sudan. It's the only city at the moment which has not fallen to the Rapid Support Forces, and it's besieged. It's almost totally encircled. We think Lord Cameron said 800,000 in there. Other people have told me higher figures, maybe 1 million, maybe 1.5 million. And they are surrounded, and there is increasingly heavy fighting around the edge of the city. It's being defended by the Sudanese army and allied militia, and it's being besieged by the RSF forces and their allied militia. So over the weekend, we were able to speak to some people in El Fashir over the phone, which is quite difficult. The communications are bad. Phone lines are often down and the internet is often down. They told me they really fear for their lives. They do think that if El Fashir collapses and is taken by the RSF, there will be a repeat of massacres. And they really don't know what they would do in those circumstances. they would probably have to flee over the border to Chad, but they fear that there would be great bloodshed as people did flee. And we heard some very dire reports from the aid charity, the medical charity, Doctors Without Borders yesterday, who said that with the fighting on the outskirts, they are helping one hospital called the South Hospital or the Southern Hospital in the city. In the past 2 weeks, that city has received 700 wounded, of which 85 have died. There is only one surgeon in that hospital at the moment who's trying to treat all those people. So that's an indication of how dire the situation is in El Fashir at the moment.
In other words, if the RSF get in there, massacres will take place. Could you just tell us what the basis is for those kinds of fears? And if so, why would the RSF be looking to essentially conduct ethnic cleansing?
Yes, so what's happened in Darfur is it's rekindled a genocidal conflict of 20 years ago. And in that conflict, it's really Arab militia have been trying to wipe out and ethnically cleanse Black African ethnic groups. That happened 20 years ago, and in the last 13 months it started to happen again. We've seen instances of that in other cities that have fallen in the most recent conflict, particularly a place called El Janina, which fell last year. And there were lots of massacres there. When the RSF took the city, thousands and thousands of people are thought to have been killed. So the fear is that that will happen again in El Fashir.
Ben, is there any international effort to stop this happening? We've had a statement from Lord Cameron. Is there any kind of international effort or diplomacy behind the scenes to avert this disaster?
There is diplomacy going on. Britain has called for the RSF to lift its siege. So have the Americans. But there are no peacekeepers. And the diplomatic efforts we've seen so far, it has to be said, have not achieved an awful lot. The war is still going on after 13 months. We think perhaps across the country, maybe 150,000 are dead. So these calls for calm, these calls for ceasefire have so far not achieved much. And that is perhaps because the people who are calling for them do not have a lot of leverage at the moment.
Well, let's zoom out then a little bit and talk about the international context here, because for listeners who aren't aware, I'm sure many are, the war is basically between the established Sudanese armed forces and the Rapid Support Forces, a very heavily armed militia that was outside the command of the Sudanese Defense Ministry. They came to blows over a year ago now. They're battling for control of the country. Both sides have sought a degree of support from regional powers and also global powers. We've heard about Russian involvement. We've heard about the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, lots of people with an interest in Sudan. So could you just tell us a little bit about this kind of jockeying of powers, what the influence and role is of outside powers in the war in Sudan?
Yes, I think that's absolutely key to what's happening, because it really is. It's a conflict that's attracted many regional powers. And as they're attracted, it makes any attempt to stop the conflict more difficult, with more and more actors involved. You mentioned some of them. Russia is involved, Iran is involved, Egypt, the Emirates, the Saudis, even Ukraine is involved. And what you're left with is what was memorably described to me as a sort of blood-soaked playground of regional powers. It's become a sort of chaotic geopolitical chessboard of these competing regional powers. They're all pursuing agendas which are not clear. They're a little bit murky. We're not sure what they're getting out of it, but they are supplying arms and diplomatic cover and supplies to the fighting sides, which makes it very difficult to stop.
Obviously, Africa saw a lot of what we would call proxy conflicts during the Cold War, with the West backing one side, the Soviet bloc backing another. We obviously are seeing the world divide into a kind of new Cold War at the moment. Is that a template we can put onto this? Is it as simple as saying Russia, China, or Iran are backing one side, the Western powers are backing the other, or is it much more murky than that in Sudan?
No, it's much more murky than that. For example, as far as we can tell, Russia seems to be giving a level of support to both sides. On the one hand, we've seen Moscow supporting the Sudanese army and fixing Khartoum's MiG fighters, But on the other hand, we hear of Russia's Wagner group helping the RSF. So it's much more murky than just saying that it's a new Cold War.
Ben Farmar, thank you very much for talking to us. Now, for decades, the world has agreed that Antarctica is neutral territory. It should never be claimed by anyone, it should never be exploited for natural resources. But Russian research vessels have now found oil on the seabed there. A lot of oil. I asked Jonathan Leake, our energy editor, what that means for the frozen continent. Jonathan, what did the Russians find, and why are people so agitated about this?
So the background to this is that Antarctica is essentially seen as a pristine continent and a place that the world collectively has agreed not to damage with mineral exploration or looking for oil and gas. And there's a treaty called the Antarctic Treaty that came into force around about 1998 and which is effectively perpetual, although it has a review point in 2048. And that treaty is meant to prevent anyone trying to exploit Antarctica or do anything that might cause it harm. And it covers all kinds of things, but in this context, oil and gas are the issues. Now, what the treaty doesn't do is preclude scientific exploration. And some countries, many countries, have taken advantage of that to carry on exploring and carrying out scientific research. The British have got several stations out there, I think 5 altogether, which are used for mainly scientific research. And just for example, they discovered the ozone layer. It was British scientists some decades ago that, looking up into the atmosphere, were able to find that the ozone layer was disappearing. So there is genuine scientific research done. But the other countries, including the Russians, have taken a very different line. And they've essentially sent down prospecting ships looking for what they describe as the stratigraphy of the seabed. In other words, what sort of rocks are down there, what kind of sediments, what's been happening to create Antarctica. That's the superficial claim they make. But they're using the kind of kit and producing the kinds of results which show very clearly they're really also looking for oil and gas deposits. So looking around the eastern side of Antarctica, they have been to done very intensive surveys of a number of bays and found very large amounts of oil, which they have reported. And the amounts reported are something in the region of 70 billion tons. And it works out to be 10 times roughly what we have ever extracted from the North Sea. So quite sizable deposits. They have been back and back to these places in a way that you would never need to do for purely scientific research.
And back. So how long has this been going on? How long have they been sending ships out there?
This has been going on for over a decade. And they have 2 or 3 ships which are equipped to look for commercial deposits of oil and gas. So this has worried some of the British experts in the geopolitics of Antarctica, who have given repeated warnings that essentially the Russians are not engaging in scientific research, but actually looking for oil and gas. And the backdrop to this is that the Antarctic Treaty, which is essentially a voluntary agreement, and what that means is that any country can at any time walk away from it. If they were to walk away from it, they would be at liberty to exploit the resources in the Antarctic. So that treaty can kind of be seen as a gentleman's agreement more than a formal treaty with legal force, because any country that broke it would not be subject to anything that mattered in the form of a legal comeback.
So that's interesting, because I was aware of that treaty, that kind of international consensus that we're not going to do anything Antarctica, and that's why no one's properly kind of planted a flag. But you're saying that could fall apart quite easily. And what struck me about this, I've been reporting stories about Russia and other countries staking claims on the resources of the Arctic seabed, kind of opened up by global warming for well over a decade, like 15 or 20 years I've been writing that story, and everyone's had their eye on it. And I noticed this, and this Antarctica always seemed off limits. But suddenly you're saying, actually, we could be seeing exactly the same kind of gold rush.
Yes, so the Arctic is a place where there's been a degree of fighting for territory already. So that I think the Russians even went to the length of putting a submarine underneath the ice to plant a flag at the bottom of the sea on one of the ridges.
At the North Pole.
At the North Pole, yeah, which they claimed as their own. The difference is the Arctic is quite near to the Russian mainland, and there's lots of ports up there. So it's relatively easy, especially if the ice gets ever thinner, to exploit those resources. And to do this is crucial, really, within the current cost envelope for bringing oil up from difficult places. So Antarctica is a different thing altogether. It's much more remote. It's hard to get to, and it would be, the conditions are, if anything, more extreme. So this would all depend on the price of oil, the availability of resources, and so on. But in the future, oil could well go up. And so I would see Russia's activities as a kind of insurance policy, so that should the need ever arise, they can go down there, they'll know where the oil is, they can step back from the treaty and essentially act with impunity.
On that point, now some of these areas, a large chunk of this area, of that part of Antarctica is, we call it British Antarctic territory, and we claim it, and it's meant to be administered by the Foreign Office as far as I'm aware. So how would that work with us if the Russians come down and plant an oil rig in what we call British Antarctic territory? And is there anything we could do about it if they did?
Yeah, so it's a very interesting question. That was really what the MPs on the Environment Audit Committee were talking about last week. What kind of rights do the various claimants to the Antarctic have? And the answer is that they don't really have any rights, because why should anyone be able to claim the Antarctic? So Britain has claimed it and has put the British Antarctic Survey in place to kind of maintain that claim. But a lot of the land that we claim, and the ice and the ocean, is also claimed by Argentina. And there are overlapping claims, I think, also with Chile. And if you take a look at the Antarctic map of claims, you'll see that over it there are claims which overlap and which are essentially would be in dispute were it not for the Antarctic Treaty, essentially making sure that everyone doesn't really act on their claims because there's no commercial exploitation going to happen.
So until that does happen, those claims are kind of dormant and academic. But once, if this does happen, if this does open up that door, then things get much more tricky kind of geopolitically.
Exactly, yeah. And then the risk is that if one country or two countries were to step away and start fishing, drilling, mining, whatever, it would start a free-for-all.
Last question on this. Thank you very much for joining us. It's been fascinating. You're our energy editor, right? And there's a lot of talk about how important it is to keep hydrocarbons in the ground if we're going to deal with net zero, all of the long-term challenge of climate change. How bad would it be if the world starts digging up what's in Antarctica?
So you can roughly say, I think, from memory, that for each ton of oil you extract, you will generate 3 to 4 tons of CO2. So if you bring out 70 billion tons of oil, you can do the math. But it's basically a lot of CO2. And Antarctica may have other resources, much of it unobtainable because of the cost right now. But who knows what will happen if prices rise or the ice melts. So yes, it's not just oil, it's gas as well, and possibly even coal that should all be left in the ground if you accept all the science around global warming, which I think everyone has to nowadays.
Jonathan, thank you so much for joining us. It's been fascinating.
It's a pleasure.
Thank you.
That's all for Battle Lines this time. Please join us again next week for more of the Telegraph's best foreign reporting. Goodbye. Battle Lines is an original podcast from The Telegraph. To stay on top of all of our news, analysis and dispatches from around the world, subscribe to The Telegraph or sign up to Dispatches, which brings stories from our award-winning correspondents straight to your inbox. We also have a live blog on our website where you can follow updates on Israel and Gaza as they come in throughout the day, including insight from contributors to this podcast. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Battle Lines on your preferred podcast app, and if you have a moment, leave a review, as it really helps others find the show. As disinformation is a particular problem during conflict, we are relying on your support more than ever. Battle Lines is part of wider Telegraph foreign coverage in our podcasts. If you're interested in finding out more about the war in Ukraine, you can listen to our sister podcast, Ukraine the Latest. Battle Lines is produced by David Degahi, and the executive producers are David Knowles and Louisa Wells.